Welcome to this webinar, which is part of a week we're running here at the Centre for Investigative Journalism, or CIJ, which is both celebrating and drawing insights from the impacts that we've seen from our Open Climate Reporting Initiative, or OCRI, or OCRI, which we've been running over the past few years. It's been really nice to see lots of people signing up to join us here today. From 42 different countries, which is very fitting, I feel, for such an international program as OCRI. Um, we've been training journalists and helping them to investigate issues related to the climate crisis and environmental harms across the world, from kind of Nigeria up to Nepal and from Paraguay to Pakistan. Um, We've had to change things around slightly from the originally advertised webinar. We were hoping to have Amy Westervelt with us, but she has had to drop out due to unforeseen circumstances. But she has also provided us with a more than capable replacement in Nina Lakhani, who's joining us and will be guiding you through this discussion today. So Nina is a global climate justice reporter with Drilled Media, and she's joined there recently from The Guardian US. So Nina, if you're happy, I'll hand over to you. The floor is yours.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Sorry for all those disappointed Amy's not here. But she is now my new boss as of January of this year. Like Tom said, I'm the Global Climate and Environmental Justice Reporter for Drilled. I did that job. I was senior reporter for The Guardian for 6 years before that, based in New York. And yeah, I guess we're all here today because we care about climate and environmental justice. My background is in covering, doing investigations, but also lots of reportage and lots of sort of reported features from impacted communities around the world. And I think as all the conversations we had today, I think it's just really important to sort of keep an eye on why does any of this matter, right? It matters because we are not all in this together. Communities who not everyone's contributed to the climate crisis, not everyone's been impacted in the same way, and not everyone is going to have access to adaptation and to solutions that are available, and also because we know that there are individuals and industries and corporations and political sort of interests that have a lot to gain from maintaining the status quo, and also are pushing solutions, false solutions, that will keep the profits going and keep communities who have been most impacted from getting access to the assistance that they need, which we sort of know what they need, right? And so that's sort of the panorama I think that we're coming to with today. We've got 3 great panelists for you today. I'm going to just introduce them quickly. We have Saeed Nazakat, who is talking to us from New Delhi, India. Saeed is the CEO and founder of Data Leads, a digital media and tech company based in India, but working across Asia and globally. The CIJ has partnered with Data Leads in the last couple of years to address climate misinformation and to deliver the South Asian version of the climate climate investigation course. So that's Saeed. He's going to be talking to us about a lot of the training that him and his organization have been doing for journalists across Asia. Then we have Maximiliano Manzoni, who's talking to us from Paraguay. Max is an OCRI trained Uruguayan journalist, but based in Paraguay. He was one of 13 journalists trained during the year 1 of the OCRI course in 2022-2023. And that was done in partnership with Fundación Gabo in Mexico in 2022. And he's going to be talking about some of the stories and investigations he's been working on. So that's Max. And then we have Adeolu Adekola, who is talking to us from very cold Canada. Adeolu has led CIJ's OCRI from inception today, providing tools and resources for climate investigations and helping manage partnerships across the regions and ensuring that the project's objectives are met. So he's going to be talking to us about the project from that perspective. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to hand over to Saeed first, who's going to give us a short presentation of the work that he's been doing. We're going to hear from all three panelists, and then we're going to have a more in-depth discussion about the work that they're involved in. Over to you, Saeed.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anina. I think really pleasure to be here and having this conversation on something which is really, really significant and I think also critical in a way when we look at what's happening globally in terms of the climate change. I think this is the one of the world's biggest challenge, or perhaps the biggest challenge all of us across the world are facing. How do we really deal with the climate change? And everyone out there essentially is dependent on the information, what really is happening, who is affected, who is benefiting, what do we know, what we don't know. All of this is actually the information. And when I look at the global risk report, they identified 10 major challenges in the world we have. Climate change was certainly there, but it was also a challenge of whether people have access to, accurate information as well about climate change or other areas of related to it and all that. So I think in that perspective, I think our work at Data is essentially has been, building on our last 10 years investment in terms of building competencies in Asia. We have been working, almost in 10 Asian countries in building skills. And when Center for Investigative Journalism, actually, we found this collaboration opportunity. We said, absolutely, we should really make sure that the journalists, particularly in South Asia, benefit from this program. So their competencies are as par with the global standard. They're able to understand first what is happening, and then they have skills and tools available how to report on the whole structure. So the whole program was designed in consultation with the team at CIJ. The program was essentially identifying first what is missing out there. Why do we really need this project, to be honest? Then we looked at, okay, what's happening in India, in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, in Nepal, in Pakistan, in this region actually. And we figured out there are a couple of things actually. When you look at from a larger perspective, you will see all of these countries, when it comes to journalism and reporting of media on climate change, they're facing almost similar issues. One essentially is there is a limited investigative journalism skill available in different newsrooms in the region. Then we figured out even if there's a skill limited, but there are limited resources because news gathering remains, it remains a cost. It needs a cost to cover the news gathering on the ground reporting cover, needs a cost. And that is also not available there. Then we also saw even if reporters they have skills, they have resources, limited whatever resources available, but then still cross-border reporting is not happening because politics in the region, other issues in the region, and also lack of the newsroom collaboration across the borders as well. And we figured out also one major challenge as well was so there are repercussions when you cover climate change. There are legal threats, physical threats, and journalists have been under pressure not to report on many aspects of, watchdog journalism when it comes to climate change. So I think that was the base through which we came up with this whole framework, essentially a design thinking exercise. Okay, this is how the kind of situation we are in. Now, our challenge was twofold. So it was you can say two phases of it. One was how to design first a curriculum, a set of skill sets which we can use to train a generation of climate journalists in South Asia. And then second was how they will go then and report on stories and all. So we had, you can say, two phases of it also. We started the whole work in 2023, essentially, when it was limited in terms of its approach to India, and we had 104 applications from climate editors, journalists, freelancers, reporters from all parts of the country. Out of that, we selected 16 master trainers, 16 climate coaches actually. And then when they got trained, we invited them, selected them to New Delhi, which is the capital of India. They got trained on first, what is the science of climate change? What are the common misinformation vectors about climate change? How to use data to investigate climate change stories, and then how to do big stories about climate change. So once they got trained about all these things, they went back and they trained a large number of journalists in different newsrooms and in different parts of the country, more than 1,000 journalists as a part of that exercise. And that really was transformative in a sense because that allowed journalists to pick new skills. Because we also realize that reporting is also increasingly becoming tech driven in terms of how to use satellite data, how to use Google Maps, and all. So I think that was a great, first year. And then quickly, maybe I can come back later, but also quickly, then in the next year, we thought, okay, as a part of this whole program, so CIG, supported the whole initiative and that idea as well, that what about having all the South Asian journalists together at a one place and, building their capacity. So we again, through an open call, we received some 160 plus applications from all across South Asia. Very senior editors, reporters, video journalists, freelancers, all of them actually came, kind of shown interest. That also gave us a sense actually that there's a lot of hunger within newsrooms actually to do journalism, do good, great journalism, do good, do great stories. It was just a lack of maybe resources and maybe also the tools and techniques for them actually how to go about it. So out of 160 plus applications from all across South Asia, we selected 10 fellows actually, and then they got invited to Sri Lanka, to Colombo, where they got extensively, trained for almost 5 day long workshop, where they were experts on, climate misinformation, climate data, and also satellite images and everything. And that training actually was quite transformative for the journalists because they also, training, yes, but they also, met other fellows and then they build a cross-border story projects as a part of the story lab, which was the aim of the second phase. And then out of all that, work, of course, they got trained, the newsrooms, the capacity increased in those newsrooms, but also we had four big stories out of that project, and which again, threw light on the stories which usually you don't hear much actually in the mainstream or regional newspapers because most of these stories were really done, visiting, going back to the communities, understanding data, verifying data, all of that. And all the four stories really have been, good. They got a lot of interest. I think they put a lot of spotlight on stories which usually you do not see in a regional media in this part of the world. So I can say that when we look at this whole project, I think it was quite a unique experience, which allowed us also at Data Lease to see that what were the gaps which were there and how we can fill them as a part of long-term process. So I think this whole project has also given us a sense how can we use this now, all the learning of last 2 years to look at future next couple of years because climate change is there is becoming more like a global problem and regional problem than ever before. So we need more journalists out there to report on it. And I can see in the last 1 or 2 years there has been a consistent increase in terms of how we report on climate change, how we report on pollutions, and all of that. So I think it has been a good learning experience for us as well, how to design programs which are engaging, which are successful. And I will make sure that I will cover a couple of more things
Thank you.
related to the
Yeah.
project when we come back to the meeting.
Thank you, Saeed. Yeah, when we come back, maybe we could you could have a think about maybe one of the big cross-border stories that you could go into a bit more detail that will get into some of the sort of benefits and that you've discussed. And yeah, that would be really helpful. Thank you. All right, I'm going to hand over to Max now. Thanks very much.
So do you hear me well? I will be a small presentation to explain a little bit more about what we do from what the lessons are from Latin America. So let's wind back in the last 4 years. Before OCRI started to work with a lot of Latin American journals, myself included. 4 years ago, the conversations about climate journalism in Latin America was more focused on explaining the scientific and the political basis of climate change to audience and also to editors. So we saw a lot of how climate change is affecting X country or X sector type of stuff. That was good for awareness because we have words like adaptation and mitigation that started to be explained. I often say that adaptation and mitigation are like the language of the future, things that will be following us in the rest of our lives. Um, and there was an interest, and I started to get interest on climate negotiations, especially after Glasgow in 2021. But also lots of media took interest because they smell money. When they talk about smell money, we're not only talking about funding opportunities, but also the hype. No, most of media organizations 4 years ago, at least in Latin America, still measure impacts and metric through social media. That's something that changed in the last 4 years for several reasons. But was something that was very key to the explosion, and I said also the bloat related to climate reporting in the region. One example of this, how climate change is affecting or explaining this story when we use Taylor Swift songs to explain actually climate negotiations. So 4 years now into what OCRI and several other organizations and reporting initiatives made journalism in climate Latin America so much better. We now enter a new phase. We mature as climate journalists in the ecosystem because climate is not a topic anymore, but it's a theme in our reporting. We have an issue with that because without initiatives like OCRI, we millennials, we are the 30 somethings. We are the last generation that learn from newsrooms, from peers inside a newsroom every day. So that kind of learning process, not only in climate journalists, but investigative journalists as a whole, is lost for the newer generations. And initiatives like OCRI are the ones who are, keeping the bases very strongly in the ecosystem. So we saw that we changed from the climate bloat to sort of climate hashing. There was some exhaustion to the explaining kind of stuff. The hype died, but some good stories remain. And when I say some, I say a lot. One of the stories, one of the showcasing here is about climate exile from Venezuela. We was told by a team of Venezuelans and very young Venezuelans, reported an amazing story with a documentary, and that showcased that more than climate journalists, we are starting to see that we need more journalists adding climate in their everyday beats. We need more local journalists adding the climate lens. Uh, we need more economy. We need more sports journalists. We need more fashion journalists adding because climate journalists only exacerbates the inequalities and the impacts of inequalities in general in the region. And also, I saw that there's still a untapped potential climate investigative journalists in particular. Initiative like OCRI made the possibility for me to become from a fellow in 2022 to actually be a trainer in 2025. I started to work specifically with investigative journalists across Latin America, from Rio Bravo in Mexico to Tierra del Fuego in Argentina, to actually start to look up for not only the impacts of climate change in our communities, but who is behind the policy decisions, the businesses, the politicians following the money. Something that might seem very basic, but it's still something that have a strong lens to work upon in the region. So very briefly about what we do and what we learn from that experience with OCRI is that what we found in Consenso, which means consensus in Spanish, which we found this newsletter in 2024, and we do climate investigations on topics like carbon credits, heat impact, and just energy transitions and lobby from Big Ag. We are based in Paraguay, but we blend hyper-local reporting with open tools and a network of collaboration across Latin America. Once again, with the death of newsrooms, collaborations between countries and between journalists in different places has become the norm and has become a need. And we aim to do what we saw. We often talk in Spanish is bueno, bonito, barato, which means attractive, affordable, and good journalists. And we are supported. What key difference between us and several other newsrooms is that we are supported by subs almost exclusively from paid sub readers to what we say we talk about impact anchors, people who don't have to pay for journalism subscription, but they give us their photographs, or they give us a lot of information, and they make sure that our journalist is coming to their communities through workshops and so on. And one thing, and we talk about impact, and what we learn with the OCRI training is that impact should be part of the design. And one case study I wanted to talk very briefly is how last year we revealed that more 10,000 children and adolescents in Paraguay major cities will be at risk when they start school due to heat island and the lack of infrastructure. This research led to a public hearing in National Congress, which is very big for a small newsroom like us. And climate is not often something that is going to Congress. With 5 ministries, 6 municipalities, students, parents, and teachers, as well as senators and representatives from 4 parties. We did this by georeferencing the schools with the help of teachers, students, and parents, and also just those using open tools like Data Wrapper, Google Maps, and Leaflet. And this was 100% funded by subscriptions. And this is because we aim it. This impact is something that we talked with the team before we start to do the investigation, because we aim to get the response from the topic we choose. Once again, thinking about climate not as a topic, but also as a lens. We wanted to talk about children, heat, education, topics that usually get a broader interest, and putting the climate lens into it. How we gathered the data, talking beforehand with the communities about identifying where schools were doing, how schools have lack of infrastructure like water, ventilations, even bathrooms. And how we present it, which was a map easy to showcase in every place. You can print it in 2 colors and share it with your neighbors. We did it in the most cheap way possible, which is also something that sometimes climate investigations have been struggling in a region with the lack of funding. Sometimes we think that climate investigation have to be this big thing with a lot of tools and work upon it, and sometimes the tools are already available. We use Leaflet, QGIS, and our first tool, which was called Hakucito. Haku means heat in Guarani, that identifies interest in colors. After this public hearing, there was actually a commission created to share our findings in the institution themselves, printed. It was all done by the state. One thing that was key for us is when the National Director on Climate Policy said that there was a milestone on the discussion of climate change in Paraguay. That is because we are very critical of the government. So to get the government involved in this is also like a badge of honor for us, because this means that our work was serious enough and impactful enough that they cannot ignore us anymore.
Okay, Max.
Uh,
Max, I'm going to stop you there because
Yeah, of
we're going to
course.
run out of time. Thank you for that. A couple of things that would be good to come back to you with. I think you meant, talking about misinformation. I think in my own reporting across different countries, misinformation is very location specific. I spent a lot of time last year reporting on communities who had been hit very hard by hurricanes and floods in Appalachia in the US, where it was very, very hard to meet anyone that didn't think climate change was a hoax. And then I also spent quite a lot of time in Acapulco in Mexico, where communities had been hit by 2 hurricanes a year apart, where everybody was talking about climate change. So I think, when we think about misinformation, there's people from, I think we've got 42 countries represented here today. I think we need to be very not just country specific, but regional specific, because misinformation is being very targeted. as we know. So have a think about that, Max. And the other thing I wanted to just ask you to think about when we come back to questions is just, I think you're absolutely right that just generally, there is an idea that investigations are something that only some journalists can do. For me, I always identified in my 20 years as a journalist that does investigations. I don't think of myself as an investigative journalist, because if you go somewhere and you find out something new, you're investigating, right? There's many ways to investigate. It isn't rocket science in many ways. And I think part of what you're talking about, and it'd be good to get into a bit more detail about, is that the climate crisis is something that's impacting every single person and every single beat, and just as one example, I always think about the Miami Herald in Florida, for example, has multiple real estate reporters, and one of those real estate reporters is now just focused on the impact of climate change on real estate in Miami. And so I think, and you just talked about education, so it'd be a good more to talk about that, because I think unless we make the climate crisis a newsroom-wide issue, like we do with the economy, like we do with so many politics, we're sort of never going to keep up. So yeah, thank you so much. We'll come back to you. Okay, last but not least, we have Adeolu Adekola, and so Adeolu, over to you.
Right. Thank you very much, Nina. Thank you for the introduction. And then I must say, listening to Said and Maxi has pretty much set the tone already. And I think from the conversation so far, we're already getting towards, what the theme of this conversation is, which is how climate investigations get resolved. Of course, that looks very direct, but of course, as we all know, and probably this is a disclaimer, investigative journalism takes time. Even responses to stories, for example, when they are done by journalists, can be unpredictable. But I think from what we have seen working on the Open Climate Reporting Initiative at the Center for Investigative Journalism, I think one of the major takeaways, which I would speak on to possibly later, is that, and it's probably what Maxi also has illustrated in his first presentation. I think there is the need for journalists to track the trajectory of their story. We run after so many stories, and then we kind of like just lose track of even what the potential impact of our stories are. So in bringing it all together, and for my opening thoughts, I think it's also very important to establish the multi-layer and the interconnection between climate change and a whole lot of things, which you have spoken to also, Nina. Whether you are, covering politics, we are covering business, sports, entertainment, fashion, education, health, I can pick on things that are climate change related in all these different bits. And so, like Max also said, climate change is no longer a topic, it's now a theme, and it's broad-based. And for you to be able to interrogate it, you have to understand the language and the communication bit of it. We also have to agree that climate change is an urgent matter and must be reported as such. That's part of the misinformation tactics that has now started to come out. It's no more mainly about denying that climate change exists. It's now obstructing actions of mitigation and adaptation. And I think being able to pick some of these things, whether it's in form of greenwashing and so on and so forth, is also very important if you want to get results from your climate change reporting. I think the subject of media framing from the 2010s of climate change has shifted from just projecting prices and activism alone, but now layering solutions and accountability in the 2020s. That's kind of like how the trajectory of reporting climate change has moved over the last 20 years thereabout. It's not so much of a bad thing, but when we start thinking about solutions and accountability comes with the moving of resources, and that's where you have things around climate finance and so on and so forth. And once you're thinking climate finance, you're thinking of accountability issues, transparency issues, vested interest, and so on and so forth. So for us, what have we been able to do with the Open Climate Reporting Initiative? We kind of like, the initial strategy leaned on several factors, but I'm just going to zero in on two for this webinar. The first was on the language of instruction. And so in delivering OCRI, we just didn't want to deliver a one-size-fits-all training. It's very important to understand, number one, that in doing climate investigations, there is the local element of it, and there is the cross-border element of it, because there are some intersections across board. So there's need to do local stories, but there are also needs to do there's need to also do cross-border stories, because sometimes you might have an organization that is headquartered in the US or the UK, but is involved in, having, getting carbon footprints and all those things, by land grabbing and all those kind of things happening in maybe the Amazon region and so on. So there might just be those cross-border elements that we should interrogate on. So we're very specific about the language of communication, the language of instruction, rather. The language of instruction involved passing on the skills onto journalists. Now, if we want journalists to do reports to get results, they have to have the skills to do those reports, which is what Said has spoken to. And that's why when we were delivering the training for year one for OCRI, for example, we said Latin America excluding Brazil for obvious reasons. And then we split Africa into Anglophone Africa and Francophone Africa. For the second year of OCRI, we had Brazil and Lusophone Africa because of the Portuguese speaking component. And that also gave us an opportunity to crossbreed ideas. And then we had Middle East and North Africa. And then we also then had South Asia. So in a nutshell, we kind of like delivered different trainings in English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Arabic. The other part of emphasis, which I want to speak to right now as I close, is the language of communication. And in talking about or in thinking about the language of communication, it's having the mindset of knowing what's essentially is the language of communication when we're talking about climate change. How do journalists understand? Part of what journalists needs to do is to understand the language of communication, because there's a whole lot of technical terms that can fly over your head. But for you to be able to understand how to report it, especially because you have different types of audiences, and we know today that there are different audience engagement mechanisms that we can use to, put out our story, also leveraging social media. But if we look at just this, this diagram, it talks about, and I took this diagram from Investigating Interacting Journalism Norms from Maxwell Boykov's book. It speaks to, the title of the book is Who Speaks for the Climate? Making Sense of Media Reporting on Climate Change. So it tells us that there are several inputs that goes into communication process. And within journalistic norms, by taking attention of things like balance, authority, order, and so on, we refine the input, and then it comes out as news and media coverage. A very salient point to note and to be aware of is that journalists and the media play a role of educating and informing their audiences. And so for you to educate and inform your audiences, you would want to pay attention to how you pass across the information that you're passing on to them. And in doing this, I would like to draw parallels with what we saw or what we learned during COVID. It's amazing how COVID happened 6 years ago, and we've kind of like forgotten what we did or how we survived it. So I did a Google search, right, on climate change words some time ago, and I found it interesting that some media platforms had things around A to Z of climate change. So A is for adaptation, B is for biofuels, C is for, all those kind of things. So I combined one from Sky News, Financial Times, and one other platform, and I had this word cloud. We can see that carbon is huge, but you can see a number of other things within this cloud. I probably know just a third of some of these, themes. But I think in thinking about how climate is communicated, number one, as a journalist, you have to understand some of these technicalities. Now, if you are on another beat on politics, on fashion, entertainment, you might not go deep, but you can just have a broad knowledge of what climate change is, and then you can interrogate some of the issues. And so when talking about COVID, everybody knew what social distancing was. Everybody knew what self-isolation was. We are moving to the point where everybody needs to understand some major key points of climate change. The issues, the events, and the information can be shaped into cause and effect. And that's one of the key things that we try to do at the CIJ. We didn't focus only on what climate change is, which has been mainstream, and its effects, which is when you had effects of flooding, and so on and so forth. But what we've tried to do is to focus on why is it happening, and that's the model that the Open Climate Reporting Initiative has, been able to empower journalists with the skills that they need to engage holistically.
Thank you very much. And yeah, we will come back to this, I'm sure. I mean, I would say that, words matter, right? And so every single word we use has an impact. The Guardian decided many years ago to stop using the phrase climate change. We use climate crisis, climate emergency. We use global heating, and I think that was really an important editorial decision about changing the narrative. I also think it's really important that we as journalists don't feel the need to use the language being used by academics or by industry, or by science, by scientists or by politicians. I mean, we are, we have control over that. I remember when I first joined the Guardian as a staff climate justice reporter, having a very interesting debate with my esteemed environmental colleagues in the UK, and saying, when you guys write 1.5 in a headline, for most people, that doesn't sound that bad. I mean, like 1.5 degrees, when you think of the weather, is nothing, right? I don't think it's having the impact that you think it's having, and so I think, or the fact that, just because the UNFCCC and governments don't want to talk about reparations doesn't mean we can't talk about reparations, So we have control over the language. We don't, as you're saying, Adeola too, and I think we don't have to. We need to just be really aware of who we're trying to reach, right? We all have a loyal audience of people who care, who are already converted and care about the climate. Our job is to reach all those people who we're not reaching already, right? And I think sometimes using phrases like mitigation and adaptation do not help us do that. So I'm sure this is something we're going to come back to. Okay, before we get into a few more questions, just a couple of things. We do have some space for questions. So please put your questions into the Q&A box, and Tom is going to sort of monitor that, and we're going to leave 20 minutes for those at the end. We have about 25 minutes now, guys, for some more in-depth conversation. So let me ask you first, Saeed. I mean, maybe you could talk about, just think about one of the 4 projects, that came out of the work that you've done, Saeed, and just think about, I guess, you said at the beginning some of the things that were lacking, and one of the things that you said was a lack of investigative skills. And I wonder, could you talk through one of these projects? Were you talking about lack of investigative skills generally? Was it about lack of investigative skills specifically to climate environmental reporting? And yeah, maybe just talk to us for about 5 minutes, if you can, just a little bit more of all of the issues and the challenges that you mentioned in your opening words, but with just one of the projects in mind. That I think has helped us orientate us sort of to something more specific. Thanks.
No, thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. Perhaps I can take, I can discuss 2 stories very quickly and give you a little perspective how this project was actually, in terms of so amazing, empowering journalists to go deeper actually on a couple of key issues. Like one of the story which got shortlisted and eventually published and got a good, response when it went out was the outcome of a story which looked at heat deaths in India. And you can see in the last 5, 6, 7 years, you will see a sudden spike of temperature across the country. Very unusual. Even in the areas where there was never ever like a crisis of, you can say, water. We're having a water crisis now because the temperature has gone really high. And one of the fellows, Jeff Joseph, decided to pitch a story during the lab discussion in Colombo when we were ending that workshop, because each one was supposed to come up with an idea, some research, and pitch it, and then all that. And when we looked at that idea, it was essentially looking at deaths because of heat wave, which is happening. And interestingly, why was this story so special and powerful? Because every second day, or third day every week, you will have stories in local newspapers that a worker was working, he got a heat stroke and he passed away. A farmer was working, got a heat stroke, he passed away. And you will see these stories in all the small newspapers, all across the country. Almost every second day, like India is a huge country, of course, and that's some official data. Like almost every second day, there's a one death because of heat stroke. And this data is like scattered, a little bit, and also not so, like you can say collected, and number could be much, much higher. But also the interesting part was when you look at the how deaths are reported in India. 80% deaths in India are not medically certified. So you don't know how people are dying in India by actually, including the heat deaths, because data is not medically separated at all. So the journalists actually went deeper and tried to look at what's happening on the ground and why the lack of data is also a big story actually. Sometimes you want to see a big story, like and say like a yeah, and thanks for putting this up actually. Thank you so much. And sometimes you feel like, hey, the big investigation only happens when there's a lot of data available. If there's no data, that's also a great story to tell, that there's nobody is paying attention to these people who are dying, the picture you're seeing on screen, because nobody is documenting their death and there's no accountability for these people who are dying actually. So I think that was really powerful story, because it was also more than 20,000 people who got sick and badly sick because of heat stroke in just one single year. And that's just a number one. And we're looking globally. I think there's a figure which is mentioned in the story. Almost 1.6 million people are estimated to die because of heat strokes globally. It's a huge number, 1 million plus people globally, and we are not really paying enough attention who is collecting this data and who is eventually responsible for it. So that was from India. And then we had a colleague from Sri Lanka, Ruxana Rizvi, an amazing journalist, and she wrote a story about actually something which has been long ignored. When people cover, particularly when West was covering, Western media was covering Sri Lankan war. As you know, Sri Lanka was having like a internal conflict which lasted for almost more than 2 decades, and thousands of people died in that conflict. So in a conflict situation, what happens is that the whole focus was on army, military, killings, everything for 25 years. And nobody was really paying any attention, of course, to climate crisis, people struggling because of climate change and everything, because the first priority was the armed conflict, which was raging, the military, the bomb blast, and everything. So climate crisis and people affecting because of that climate change took completely a backseat. And Ruxana, decided to pursue a story where she went back to a northern side of Sri Lanka, which was mostly hit by the, conflict and armed conflict. And she went deeper into community. And what she found was also quite really revealing of the impact of climate crisis on women actually of Sri Lanka. Because when men died during the conflict, the women were forced to go out and feed families. And only thing they can do was actually to farm, because that was the easily thing available for them. But then if you look at that story as well, and when she goes deeper into that, she figures out almost 25% families in particular districts out there are headed by females actually. There's no male person leading the family, there's a female leading it. And then these women are farming. And what they are now facing, they lost their family, their husbands, brothers, and all in the conflict. Now they have a land, they want to do a crop and feed their family and everything, whatever. But now what they're finding is actually a strict change in climate change, which is not actually even allowing them to have a basic livelihood. And she did interviews with women out there, which is very difficult sometimes for a foreign journalist to do it, and somebody who just goes for a day and comes out. Then more interestingly and importantly, she also looked at historical data. She also looked at Google Maps. She also did a multimedia package, about it, explaining it in a very simple terms to the outside audience what really is happening in the northern Sri Lanka, which has been long, devastated by a regional conflict, armed conflict, where more than 100,000 people died. And now, how are they now, mostly women, how are they now actually dealing and struggling with the climate change, because there are inconsistent rains, and this the farming is hit, and women are eventually the worst victim of climate crisis in Sri Lanka. So I think these two stories were really powerful in terms of putting spotlight, a very clear spotlight on key issues, and making sure people understand that these are the real stories which need to be told. And I think it would have been almost impossible for them to report these stories if it was not through this program, actually, whether it was brainstorming, because each story also went through a lot of brainstorming, feedback, a lot of back and forth in terms of it. And eventually, amazing reporters on the ground telling the story.
Thank you so much, Saeed. Both of those stories look
Yes,
amazing. Yeah, I think just to comment on, I guess, around the heat story, a sort of something that I've done a lot of reporting on in recent years. I mean, even in the US, the so-called richest country in the world, they have absolutely no idea how many people are dying from heat every year. The US, whereas in Europe, in other places, you have you have these epidemiological data which will tell you after a heat wave how many unexpected deaths were likely caused by a particular heat wave. The US chooses not to do that, and there is only I've spent the last 5 or 6 years spending the summers in Phoenix, which is the hottest city in the US. It's the fifth biggest city, where we know at least 500 to 600 people die just in that city every year of extreme heat. And that's the only county in the US that actually has a robust method of doing autopsies on suspected heat deaths. But even those, I'm very sure, undercounting them. So I think this is obviously a very global issue, and as I always like to remind myself, every kid born this year, this is the coldest year they'll ever experience in their lives, right? And so extreme heat is going to get worse and worse, and it's an issue for all of us. I'm going to just a couple of investigations that I've done. I'm going to get Tom to share in case people are interested. Obviously, from a US perspective, through to what you're talking about, Saeed. I think this is like, these are global themes and stories, and you're absolutely right. This is about going to places, talking to people on the ground, and because this is why it matters, right? Like this is what this is the storytelling that I think is really impactful. Thank you very much. Max, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about, I guess, how as your work and as your role has, I guess, evolved over the last few years, like how are you sort of in Latin America? I mean, when I was based, I covered Mexico and Central America for many years, and really at a time where we were warning about what climate change was going to do. We're way past that now, right? And like back then I was, doing trainings for, like you said, trainings for journalists in Central America, just about how to talk about climate change. We're sort of, we're moving on from that. But how are you incorporating the training and the sort of capacity building across beats, across newsrooms, so that our colleagues who focus on politics, or our energy reporters, or our business reporters aren't falling into the traps of industry sort of talking points and political sort of, greenwashing and so forth? I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
That's a very good question, because it's something that we discuss a lot on when I became a trainer from OCRI with several Latin American journals that usually come from a different past. I used to work, for example, in my past life, I was a fact checker. I actually fact check, work in a collaboration of fact checking on the COVID pandemic. So it was very close to heart what Adelo said. But something that I usually try to focus on is one, try to forget that this false dilemma that this is a very complex topic, very technical topic, because that's what the people who had vested interest on this, very technocratic vested people, usually wants you to think. And think also a lot about how, without understanding the climate beat, you are missing the whole picture. That usually is also made for by example. One key example I usually use on training is our work on carbon credits, because we work on carbon credits not only from the methodology standpoint on the greenwashing claims, but who were the people behind the push for carbon credits in South America, in particular in Paraguay. So one specific story that we did was how the senator pushing for the carbon credits law in Paraguay actually was related to a guy who is a shareholder of one of the main projects, who also is pushing the government to have a kind of international treaty with Singapore. So it was a whole all over the place between, meetings in New York that was actually published by the government, but no one gets the gist of it, why these people is, meeting with these people. There was people who covered the president and covered the government, or even cover international politics, that we are getting the why Singapore, for example, is pushing for carbon credits agreement on the Article 6 in the Paris Agreement. We don't getting this information, they will understand why Paraguay is suddenly very interested on this, on why suddenly there's a lot of people talking about carbon credits on Congress. So the main takeaway is that this is not a climate story. This is a political story that needs to understand climate and climate negotiations and climate policy to actually get all the actors. That is one of the things. Also, some people seems to be very stale on their coverage. When you have enough time doing one specific type of coverage, for example, education or health, you start to see that every time of the year we have the same conversation about stuff. In Paraguay, at the start of the year, we have the conversation about the poor infrastructure and public schools. So getting people to understand that climate will refresh their interest in their own bits, in their own imperfections, is also a very good way to get people out of the comfort zone and try to get new things. And one last thing is something about being serious about doing reporting doesn't need to be solemn. The also solemnity is also I go against what we want to do, which is getting new people on board on the discussion. And also I want people to, enjoy and have fun doing the reporting. When I think about having fun is, okay, you do your series reporting, who you want to do this? You want to be cringe? Do cringe stuff. If this is not work against the story, if this could add to the story, just try it. And if it doesn't work, okay, try another thing. But also start to getting people to understand that if we want to survive in this struggle ecosystem that is information integrity ecosystem in general and journalists in particular, we need to be more flexible on the way we talk about stuff, also keeping the principles of investigative journalism, ethics.
Yeah, thanks so much, Max. That's really helpful. Yeah, I mean, we are all on the doom beat, right? I mean, there's not that much happy news coming out of what we do. So I think you're right. I think finding stories that are this isn't about looking for like happy stories or good news stories, though. I think when people ask me what gives me hope is that actually, until 500 years ago, indigenous people across the world were living in a very, balanced way with the planet, and they have the solutions. Impacted communities, frontline communities are not only the victims, they have the solutions, and that's a good place to look. Some of the stories that have done incredibly well for The Guardian have been around indigenous people, going back to traditional farming techniques, using, new technologies with traditional knowledge, reopening salmon runs, or so really looking at it, looking with an open mind about who are the experts we should be listening to. I think that can give a lot of hope. But yes, I think some of the surprising stories, right? I think one of the stories that has really started to cut through, I think, in the US and in Europe, has been looking at the impact of the climate crisis on top level professional sports, for example. When you have American football players or tennis players collapsing because it's too hot, for example. Do you know what I mean? Like it gives it sort
The
of
last Copa America in the US happened to have that.
yeah, exactly. Do you know what I mean? Like, and I think it's sort of, we're telling their similar story. They're the same. It's a story we want to tell, but you're trying to break through to people who read sports coverage and they don't read climate coverage, right? So I think you're absolutely right. Being more expansive of how we're thinking about these stories. Adeolu, to you now. I wonder if you could sort of talk a little bit more about, I guess, thinking about communication and thinking about the training and the work that you're doing within the panorama of misinformation and disinformation. You're obviously we're working with journalists from all around the world. We sort of touched upon this already, like what the way that sort of, I guess, particular actors, whether it be industry and others, are managing to sort of, not just deny. I think denial still is going on, but to sort of, to delay, to sort of to block, to sort of distract people is very different, right? In my experience at least. And I just wonder if you could talk a bit more about that and how the reporters and on this call, others on this, investigators on this call, should really be thinking about misinformation and disinformation in their reporting, but also very much in their storytelling.
Yes, very valid, very, very valid question. And Nina, thank you. And I mean, having trained nearly 750 journalists now, from 58 countries actually, and supporting 171 stories that have been published since we started OCRI. We've kind of like seen some patterns, which is part of what I spoke to initially, that yes, there is the local perspective on climate change, but there is also the cross-border perspective. And in dealing with things around obstruction, misinformation, and so on and so forth, it's informed part of the work that Said did in Asia. There was the framework that some journalists were trained, and then they became climate coaches. They had the overview understanding of what climate change is, what it is not, who are the actors, who are the players, and so on and so forth. And then they took that message granularly to other, beneficiaries, students, researchers that are not conversant with climate change, and so on and so forth. And the idea is that when we go granular that way, we're able to pass across even to, other active people or citizens generally on the knowledge around, what climate change is and what it is not, and what people need to pay attention to, and even to also generate interest in the topic and the subject. I think for journalists, especially in being able to tackle climate change, it speaks to what I said initially around gaining knowledge in climate communication. But essentially, it's now going deeper to number one, investigating and exposing wrongdoings. Now, whether it's through fact checking, whether it's through interrogating corporates and governments, or whether it's through exposing greenwashing, I think the role of investigative journalism, or journalism as a whole, and the media is very clear. Sometimes powerful corporates with interest, they kind of like influence state actors to disregard environmental hazards. So in a local community, do you have an industry or an organization that's polluting the environment, right, consistently? And so sometimes you also have to look at the weaknesses in regulatory frameworks. So, for example, you have countries submitting their plans to the UN. At the last COP, some of those plans were revalidated. So, in actual fact, how are countries taking those actions in the space of regulatory framework? We saw that kind of thing happening in West Africa with one of the partners that we worked in. I think also in that regard, we have to look at journalists have to be detailed in explaining what is happening on the ground. And so you use the story, for example, of you know, sport football players or soccer players who, you know, were fainting due to heat wave and collapsing during the game. That is the headline. That's what will attract everybody. But you have to go deeper. Why is this happening? So what has been the heat wave? What has been the heat map over X number of years? And what has the government done, or what have stakeholders done? Matters around driving climate justice and equity also lie within explaining what is on the ground. So, for example, we have OCRI supported stories about illegal miners on the border between Brazil and Guyana, threatening indigenous people in Raposa, Serra do Sol territory. And then something around what Said also said, the story about Tamil women in Sri Lanka, because they were widows, their husbands had gone to war. That was a conflict story. And we also worked with a partner in Sudan, for example, around how the connection between conflict and climate change. And that takes me to my next point, for example, about making connections. Conflict and climate change, what are the connections? So in Syria, Palestine, and all the wars going on, there are elements of climate change embedded in such things. But in also talking about explaining what is on the ground, I alluded to something on carbon credits, right? So we have a story, for example, on the Jari carbon credit project, deceiving communities and invading lands in Brazil. And you had corporates such as BMW, Telefonica, Brazil benefiting from those carbon credits framework. Now, getting carbon credits, it's kind of like a proposed solution to adapt or mitigate climate change. But when you look at the carbon footprint, is it actually a solution? So we have to be able to bring some of these stories and bring them to the fore, tell the struggles of people in these regions, and it's the first step to getting equity and justice. And I would like to also mention looking at the bigger picture, right? And I've mentioned that once there is flow of money or once there is flow of resources, we have things around transparency, accountability, and vested interest. Now we have an example working in Anglophone Africa with Oxpecker Center for Investigative Environmental Journalism. We had journalists on the ground who were able to bring up 200 data points of renewable energy projects in Anglophone Africa. And one of the stories that was done with boots on the ground was that there was a renewable energy project in Lesotho of about $15 billion of a wind farm project actually that has just vanished. Now, those 200 data points of renewable energy projects are some of the outputs and resources that we have made publicly available. Those projects were about $6.5 billion in 5 Southern African countries. And we've also made those data points available so that anybody interested could look at it and then, possibly then interrogate further some of these, claims around projects, around financing, mitigation, and adaptation. And I think the last thing I'm going to say is making connections, which I spoke to earlier. Now, you have electronic vehicles and so on and so forth as a possible mitigation strategy or adaptation strategy to climate change. How do we live with some of these things, or how do we move away from fossil fuel? But a key element in the production of batteries, lithium-ion batteries, is cobalt, right? And about 70 to 75% of the global supply of cobalt is in the Democratic Republic of Congo in Central Asia. Now, if you look at the framework of what is happening there, mining cobalt and so on and so forth, it's not palatable, right? And so we have to, part of what we did with OCRI and in bringing together the different ecosystems and framework was we needed to hold to account actors, and this informed, getting data on different kind of things. This informed following the money on climate finance, interrogating corporates, interrogating government, interrogating enablers. And then this also informed using some tools, which I'll probably speak to on one of the questions already asked by Nia on possible tools that can be used for doing this sort of stories. But I think from getting the skills to enabling shifts, it's making these connections, giving an overview of the bigger picture, being able to interrogate what is actually happening from the point of what or where climate change is caused or made to where it is being felt.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I could pick up on a couple of those points. I mean, I would definitely personally say that 50% of my job is about connecting the dots. I write for an international audience, and all stories are local, right? And so connecting the dots is very much, I think, a huge part of good, impactful journalism. And you mentioned Gaza and Palestine, Adeolu. Over the last 2 years, I've done a lot of reporting on the climate impact and their ecocide alongside the genocide in Gaza. And actually, it's been very interesting to see either the silence or the criticism I've had for that from people in the environmental space, sort of saying, well, how could I be talking about the climate when people are being directly, killed? It's not one or the other. Like climate change, the climate crisis is one of the biggest threats faced in Palestine, Palestinian people and the region. Accountability doesn't have to be one or the other thing, right? We need to connect the dots for all of these things, exactly like you're saying. The other thing I would just pick up on is just, you sort of alluded to, but just the importance of relationships and trust, right? We're living in a time where people are increasingly being told to distrust and mistrust the media. I feel just globally speaking, especially in countries like in very populous countries like India, like the US, Brazil, a lot of people are receiving information in their news from very local media, right? That's the relationships they're more likely to trust. And so when you have a massive storm, a Category 5 hurricane that's been fueled by global heating, and you see much of the local media not even mentioning the climate crisis in their reporting, it's such a wasted opportunity, right? Because these are the news people that most people trust. So I think for us and for you guys, like how some of that relationship building on a one-to-one basis is really important, but how can we collaborate with news sources that people are turning to and to trust? Can we do joint publications? If you say the reporters that you're working with, if they're publishing in like big newspapers, for example, can they do interviews on very local radio stations, on community radio stations where many people are getting their, in Latin America for certain, there's a lot of community radio where actually most people get their information. How can we bring our publications, our information to sources which people actually do trust, or at a time of a lot of distrust? So yeah, thank you all so much. I'm going to go to some questions now, so just bear with me. Give me just 1 second. I think a couple have been answered, but let me see. Okay. Let's have a look. What open source tools have the speakers found, have you all guys found useful for climate investigations? If there's anything else, you talked a little bit about, I guess, some of these already, but if any of you've got any more sort of tips for people about open source tools, that would be really helpful here for climate investigations, please.
Yeah.
Adeolu, do you want to take that?
Yes. I mean, Max has given some tools, and I would also like to mention a few others. So in thinking of tools, we went from delivering some of these trainings in different regions, and we took lessons from delivering these trainings, and then we brought it together into what has now become the climate investigations course that is now delivered by the CIJ as a scheduled course. So we had 3 runs for the inception last year. So we would also have another 3 runs this year. The first full module is already sold out starting in March. So we have currently up the one started in May. But we took elements from lessons to be able to use the open source tools. So, for example, things around satellite mapping, image mapping, using social media, for example, it's part of what we've used. Being able to use satellite mapping and imagery. We also use some elements of fact-checking tools, the different fact-checking tools that are used in tackling disinformation and misinformation. We also bring something on board on all trade tracking to be able to track, because when you are talking about fossil fuels being responsible for greenhouse gas emissions or partly part of it, we have tools that you can use to do all trade tracking. So we have quite a number of tools embedded because we have a module, for example, called EcoSynth, which is environmental and climate OSNIT. So from the use of things like Sentinel, Google Spreadsheets, so to speak, Global Forest Watch, Google Earth Pro, Google Earth Engine, and so on and so forth, just to mention a few.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if anyone else wants to add something, but I would just also say that I would really encourage reporters to collaborate with people outside of journalism, collaborate with economists, collaborate with climate scientists, collaborate with medical examiners, non-profits who often have brilliant researchers who've decided they don't want to be part of academia, because there are things that are going to be very hard for us to do as journalists because either we don't have this, the right skills, we don't have the time, we don't have resources, we don't have access to the databases. And so I feel like, collaborations across disciplines has been some of the best work that I've done in my career. And I think it can be really, really fruitful. So be open-minded about that.
I mean, that was part of my closing credits
I'm
about
sorry.
being able to
Sorry.
collaborate with, but yeah, you're very, very true. Very true.
Okay, another question here, one from Max. Max, could you share a few examples of specific impacts or results that reporters should be thinking about when brainstorming a project, thinking about, local policy change, stopping a new data center, etc. And the question also is there a danger of outlets being considered accused of activist journalism with this approach? I have a view on that, but I'm going to leave it to Max.
I will start by the second question, and I will say that this is a danger that will happen. Either you have an impact or you don't have an impact when you talk about several issues, not only climate change. And most of the time, the people who accuse you to do activism journalism is people who are very uncomfortable with your journalism. So the key difference is, okay, I will be accused of doing activist journalism, but also helping a community or, making a contribution to the people who actually pay for my journalism or care about these issues or broaden the discussion on certain issues or not. When we talk about the specific impact, we think a lot on not only of the output of the investigation, but also how we design the investigation. The example I did on schools, that was because of that. Sometimes there's only about, moving the Overton window on a topic. I love one of the key quotes I often use on this is a quote from the Twilight Zone, which was one of my favorite series, which is "We will not end the end nightmare, but we'll explain it." Sometimes it's about, planting a flag and saying, okay, this is happening. Maybe a few years from that, someone else will take the flag and move it to someone else. Impact is not linear in that way. Sometimes it's just, about getting this story done. So there was something about this outside, the greenwashing or the PR that some governments and businesses do. Caron Grace is one of the examples, but also I will think about the investment on AI data centers. Sometimes it's about getting a new refresh on a topic that was already discussed. So adding a new sense of the discussion about infrastructure and education is something that usually happens in Paraguay every start of the year. So we adding to the discussion the climate lens, help run the issue, but also refresh a discussion that was already with fatigue for the audiences. So we keep the thing on the collective mind. And sometimes you can check to trigger specific policy changes. That is a combination of aiming to that from how you do the investigation and how you present it. It's a matter of how you engage with the relevant stakeholders related to that, and also a matter of luck. There's something that political alliance, and there's just the election year, and some deputy wants to make a name for himself, so he took the investigation and put all. Something that I learned to do, but this is something that may be controversial for some people. I work for a very critical news outlet for at least 10 years. We did a lot of very good journalists that no one actually used it. So when we found consensus, we wanted to do the same kind of journalism, will be more proactive on making this to change. And one specific study we did is that we identified via OSINT tools that there was a lithium mining prospection approved by the government on indigenous lands protected by the international measure by a tribe in Paraguay, in the Chaco region. And this is a big story, but something that could happen is that we publish a story and nothing else happened, and the mine is still going on, and the government says that this is about investment and so on. So when we publish a story, the very next day, we actually go to the Ministry of Environment and showcase how we identify this specific wrongdoing, and we share the methodology with them. So in our story, we will still very critical about how the Ministry of Environment could not see this when they sent the environmental license. Obviously was a some level of corruption, and we publish about that. But then we go to the Ministry of Environment and say, okay, you want to do something about it? This is how we identify it. We share with you the methodology. You can use it from this specific case, but also you can use it for all the mining case. And sometimes, especially on the medium level of governments, you have the high levels and the high, political ambitions and related interests. But sometimes people who work on the middle of the pack, is some technician overwork and underpaid that sometimes don't have the time to check all the laws when they put a stamp. Sometimes it's about that. So actually, being in a good sense, being very firm on our research, but also, okay, guys, this is an opportunity for you to change this. That is a way of us of keeping respectful the discussion, not personal, but getting impact. The lasting impact is not only they disapprove the license, the mining license and the environmental license, but now the Ministry of Environment is openly using our data framework to identify future overlap of indigenous lands with mining. So that's something that allows us to get a lot of impact of a very cheap way of doing journalism and be a very small newsletter. But it's something that you might need to get very right from the start. What is your editorial stance on that? How you will approach public officials and also private people? How you can identify when people do things because they're underpaid or they, in a good faith, and when they have, best interest. It's a case for case basis, but you might need to be very open-minded about how we get our journalists to the communities, to the people who actually can do something about it. Sometimes, once again, it's not a straight line, but I just finally said, if you care to be called an activist journalist, in this days and age. We, the biggest nationist government ruling an empire right now. You are in the wrong line of work.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Max. Absolutely. I mean, it's a age-old trope, right, to call us activists. And yeah, personally, I think objectivity is bullshit. There is a truth, and our job is to get to that truth and tell people. We don't have much time. I think we have less than 10 minutes. I just want to get to a couple of other questions. Saeed, someone is asking you in the chat. You know, it in the same way our political sort of journalist colleagues try to focus on kitchen table issues like the price of eggs or the price of milk and so forth. And that's sort of what really, in the end of the day, people care about their their sort of personal economies. Do you think reporters should be focusing on how climate change is making groceries or healthcare more costly? Insurance is a big one, right? Certainly in the US and Europe, houses are becoming uninsurable in some coastal areas. So, Saeed, do you think that's a good way for climate reporting to go? And are there any databases on these impacts? I think that question is specifically asking, like, specific databases on that link the price, the cost of living with climate change. I know for insurance that exists, but I don't know for other things. Saeed.
No, I think this is a good question. And I before I answer this, I think you made a great point, and I see a huge value in that. And I personally believe in that, like journalists should not really answer questions. Like journalists are not experts actually. So journalists, the responsibility, our responsibility is to ask questions and then find people who will have answers to those questions. I think that's really fundamental role we have. And I think one of the things, and that's the biggest challenge in the climate, stories, that finding stories every single day which will connect with the people. The toughest job in the journalism is finding stories, story ideas, right? I think unless you make climate change relevant to the daily life, it will not resonate with people. What we are seeing is like a IPCC discussions, UN discussions, a lot of paperwork, policy frameworks. People really do not understand this language. So I think it's a great way. Like, what about if we tell people because of climate change, your egg supply, your food supply is getting disturbed. You may not have this vegetable in next 2 years, 3 years, or this fruit in this particular season, or a climate change may actually increase your electricity bill next year. And then they will say, how? How is that possible? How is climate change and electricity bill connected, actually, for that matter? Or if we tell people how air pollution actually is connected or may create further situation due to climate change, long winters and more pollution for that matter. If both combine together, what will happen, right? What if there's no sun for a couple of months? What about you getting like a weaker in terms of your vitamin D composition in your body? Like all of these things actually connecting and making them simple for people. Like instead of saying 1,000 people are dying in a year because of climate change, because of heat waves, what if you say every single day so many people are dying? The story changes automatically actually, so it becomes more profound. I think the challenge is also the capacity of journalists actually to break down jargons from the climate change story, actually, climate crisis story, or cross-border stories for that matter. How a crisis in one country is fueling crisis in other country, and if you document that. And I think a lot of discussion about data, of course, is a challenge. Some countries are very good with data, they collect a lot of data, some are not. But a lack of data is also a good story actually when you cover climate change, because you can say there's no data, nobody's bothered about it actually,
Yeah.
right? That becomes also an interesting story.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Like thinking about extreme heat in the US, the only reason they're not collecting accurate data on heat deaths is because they don't want to know. They don't want to know. I mean, that's, there's no other reason why they
And
wouldn't be
in
collecting
India,
it.
I must tell you some credit to the US. In India, the whole air pollution in New Delhi, the whole discussion started because the US Embassy started monitoring air pollution in Delhi for their employees. And
Yeah,
they put a big, like projector outside their embassy,
yeah,
starting AQ levels and all. And that's how local population here started realizing the AQ level is high. And then the Indian Express, which is a leading newspaper
yeah,
here, for a one complete year, every single day they had a solution, they had a story on air pollution in Delhi. And now today, it's a number one political story in the national capital. What is government doing about air pollution? And that
yeah.
changes a lot of, yeah, a lot of debate, as well.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And I think Max was getting at this and Adeolu as well. And just as we're wrapping up now, I think, when we're thinking about impact and we're thinking about what we're trying to achieve in our reporting, a large part of it is changing the narrative, right? It's about, and how we do that through investigations, through storytelling, through the words that we use, through the experts, the people that we consider to be experts, through that, how we tell these stories is key to this, right? And by changing that narrative, we can have an impact on so many different levels, from like, from moving one particular reader to come and offer help to somebody that you feature in the story, something that's happened to me on multiple occasions, to seeing that it changed to a national policy, to seeing a corrupt mayor being ousted from his job. This is all about change, us having, telling the, truth telling and changing the narrative, right? And that has an impact. I want to say, I know we haven't got to all the questions. I'm really sorry, but we need to wrap up. I wanted to say thank you to all of our panelists. It's been like really interesting, and I'm just going to hand over to Tom. Thank you all for joining this webinar. I hope it's been interesting and useful. I've shared a few stories that have come up during this discussion, which Tom will share, and I think all the panelists have too. People want to get in touch. I think people's emails will be made available. But yeah, I'm just going to hand over you to Tom just to say closing remarks.
Thanks so much, Nina. Really appreciate you stepping in and doing such a wonderful job guiding us through this discussion. And thanks also to our panelists. Thanks, Syed. Thanks, Max. And thanks, Adeolu, for everything you've done. Yes, we didn't get to all of your questions, I'm afraid, but as Nina says, we will be sharing contact details for the full panel in an email along with the recording and some links to stories for you to read more. So please do send the questions we didn't get to or any questions that come up for you after the webinar to the panelists. And yeah, do get in touch with them. We want to foster collaborations with climate journalists across lots and lots of different regions and across borders. We all need to be kind of working together and pulling in the same direction on this. So thanks for that. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time.